Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. So today's tutorial is going to be a nice simple one on how to update a simple text page. Now I have this bit here about meeting Drac, if you're interested in seeing me in the flesh as it were, and as you can see it needs a little bit of updating. So I'm just very simply putting in a complete section so people know where I have been, and now there's an ongoing section. So also if you've missed the announcements previously, spoiler alert, here they come. So I'll be in the States in February, and I'm just going to put in a couple of dates now, and obviously that means I can adjust that as well. And very simple, all the standard commands that you're used to if you are familiar with web browsers or any kind of text-based documents. So Control B, Control I for bolds and italics, and here we go. So there go the two dates so far. One on the 11th for Battleship New Jersey, one on the 16th for San Diego Place TBC, and pretty much that is as easy as it could possibly be to update a text-based section of your website. Once it's complete, just put in the final indicators, a little bit of formatting you want to do. Obviously you can put links in, save, and done. Easy. So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drakenfell. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show. At the conclusion of the Second World War, the United States Navy had a little bit of a quandary. Work on the last two Iowa-class battleships, BB-65 USS Illinois and BB-66 USS Kentucky, had been paused, and restarted at various points during the latter part of the Second World War, as it had been fairly clear, relatively early, that they probably wouldn't be finished in time for the end of the war, and, well, the US wasn't exactly short of a few fast battleships, and there was a bit of steel shortage going on. Nonetheless, with the war over and several major building schemes winding down, they were still left with the incomplete hulls of two Iowa-class battleships. Illinois, despite being the earlier of the two ships by number, was by far the less complete, still sitting on the slipway with her lower hull not quite finished. Kentucky at least had been moved over to a dry dock. The question of what to do with these two ships had been plaguing the US Navy for quite some time. They'd looked into potentially finishing the two as aircraft carriers, except that although the plans were drawn up, it had been pointed out that it would actually cost more to convert the incomplete hulls to aircraft carriers than it would cost to simply order another Essex class, and the Essex class could carry more aircraft than the proposed conversion, and would also be built quicker anyway. So that idea was dropped. But then came the rather wonderful set of plans that were designated SCB-19. More particularly, that stands for Ship Characteristics Board, Project Number 19. Starting from 1946, the aforementioned board assigned a different project number to each concept that they were investigating, although this doesn't mean that there had just been 19 projects before this. There, for example, doesn't appear to have been an SCB-18, but there were a number of semi-duplicated projects. There was SCB-2 and 2A, 6 and 6A, 7 and 7A, 9 and 9A, and 12 and 12A. Although, to be fair, the A's were usually just improved or worked over versions of whatever whole number they'd been previously assigned. But when it came to SCB-19, the idea was to examine the potential of converting one or both of the half-completed Iowa class into some kind of anti-aircraft battleship. Now, we know that there were quite a number of designs prepared, because they tended to start with A and then go through B, C, D, etc., and we know they got at least as far as H. But of those plans, only 3 plans that we know of at the moment have actually survived to the present. The characteristics of some of the other plans have been mentioned in various literature, but the actual drawings seem to have gone AWOL at some point. The remaining set are Scheme F, Scheme G, and Scheme H, and the reason you're hearing about them at the moment is because recently there was an announcement in the game of World of Warships that they were introducing a ship they had dubbed USS Illinois. And when people saw it, there was a little bit of a predictable uproar because it looked to be some variant of an Iowa-class hull, but with quadruple 8-inch 55 turrets. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, the 8-inch 55 is, of course, the auto-loading gun from the Des Moines-class heavy cruisers. So these ships are proposed as having 12 of these guns in 3-quad turrets, taking the place of the 3 triple 16-inch found on the Iowas. And, well, this kind of hybrid battleship cruiser is something of a turn-up for the books. We've had battle cruisers before, where people had stuck, at least initially, battleship-grade guns on a cruiser hull, but sticking cruiser-grade guns on a battleship hull is a fairly unique idea. Now, as you can see from the limited amount of pictures that we've got thus far, the Illinois in the game appears to have a fairly standard US fast battleship-style superstructure, a pair of funnels, a pair of masts, both of which are mounting some form of radar, and a bunch of 5-inch 38 turrets arranged on port and starboard, as well as the main armament of 8-inch guns. The secondaries in particular are 5-inch 38s, 10 of them, which is pretty much standard Iowa-class layout. There's also 16 3-inch guns in 8 twin mounts somewhere on the ship, and a bunch of 20mm Oerlikons. Now, this got me thinking, how does this compare to any of the SCB-19 designs that have survived? And this is where the benefit of having a few friends comes in handy, because Prince Blip, who some of you may know, was thinking along the same lines, and we happened to get chatting on one of the Discord forums that we're part of. And we were thinking, where exactly could one find the plans? Because they're not really available online. There's a few very grainy photos of them, but not really enough to make any clear direct evaluations ourselves. I was able to track down the National Archives registry number for the USS Kentucky, because as the more complete of the two hulls, that was the ship that was generally considered for completion first, and then if they managed to do that, they could work those lessons into completing the less well-finished Illinois. Now, of course, the problem that we have is that the plans for the Kentucky have not yet been digitized and released on the National Archives website, which, if you're over in the UK, means they might as well be inaccessible because, well, it's a long way across the Atlantic to go and look at a few rolls of plans. However, Prince Blip had a little bit of a brainwave and emailed the National Archives and said, could you send me some scans of them, please? And they did. And so, thanks to him, we can have a look through all 3 schemes and see how they differ and how that compares to what's being proposed for Illinois. Now, I should note that the original scans, because they are colour scans of the original plans, are very, very faded blue ink on yellow paper, so I've had to put them through several rounds of attempted digital restoration to make them a little bit more clear. So if you're wondering why they look the way they do, that's why. But nonetheless, let's start off by looking here at Scheme F. Now, Scheme F, as you can see, is something of a radical departure from the Iowa class. It's keeping the whole profile, but the main turret arrangement has gone from 3 down to 2, and as you can see, these are in fact the quad 8-inch 55 caliber, and they're taking the positions of what most people would call turret A and turret X, although in true US nomenclature, the turrets on the Iowas would be 16-1 and 16-3, and so these would be 8-1 and 8-2, because the 16-2 turret has gone completely. Nonetheless, you have effectively almost a pre-dreadnought style layout of quad 8-inch 55, and these were supposed to have anti-aircraft use as well as anti-surface use. So keep that in mind. So this is a very large ship, one less main gun than a Des Moines class heavy cruiser, but you'll notice there's a lot more other guns. There are in fact 20 twin mounts for the new 5-inch 54 caliber gun. This is, broadly speaking, the long barrel weapon that was designed to replace the 5-inch 38 in US service, and is the direct ancestor of the 5-inch 54 caliber weapon that's in use on the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers today. So the ship has 40 of these guns, of which 22 can bear on either broadside, since 2 of the mountings are mounted amidships, one right aft and one set back from a pair of slightly more forward wing-mounted guns. And this means that 11 out of the proposed 20 mountings can bear on either broadside, and of course gives you slightly better fore and aft fire as well. And the anti-aircraft armament is rounded out by 3 pairs of twin 3-inch 70 guns. You have 2 there on the fantail, and 1, rather helpfully, right in front of the forward 8-inch quad gun, which I'm sure would have been an absolute delight of a place to serve if these things had been built, if you happen to be assigned to that particular 3-inch gun crew. There is also a plethora of fire control directors. Now, keep an eye on the superstructure, because that'll be key when we look at G and H. In Scheme F, you can see we have 2 towers, what I tend to call the US pyramidal type towers, one just aft of the bridge and one just aft of the second radar mast. And these contain a pair of Mark 54 gun directors. These are successors to the Mark 34 gun directors, and if you want to find a Mark 54 these days, well, go and see USS Salem up near Boston, because the Des Moines class were equipped with a pair of Mark 54 directors, so shockingly, a ship that has the same gun is using the same director. It also has 4 Mark 37 directors and 4 Mark 56 directors. These are all noted as being for the 5-inch guns, and they're laid out in 2 slightly different patterns. The Mark 56s are arranged in 2 pairs amidships on the superstructure, one slightly to either side, whilst the Mark 37s are laid out in an elongated diamond formation. The aftmost Mark 37 is just forward of the amidships 5-inch 54 mount that's positioned effectively superfiring over the 8-inch 55. Another Mark 37 mount is positioned just above the bridge, and the other 2 are positioned one on either side of the ship's single funnel. There are 3 final fire control director systems mentioned. These are called GUNARS, or GUNARS systems, and they are earmarked as being for the 3-inch 50 caliber guns, and since there are 3 of them, one presumes that they are mounted with the 3-inch guns themselves. And that brings us along to Scheme G. Now, Scheme G might at first appear to be a slight revision, but it is in fact quite a different ship to the previous one. For one thing, the most obvious thing you might notice, we're back to 3 turrets, so we now have 12 automatic 8-inch guns laid out in exactly the same pattern as you would find on a regular Iowa-class battleship. So that's fun. One of the advantages of this scheme is that forward 3-inch mount is now considerably further away from the forwardmost 8-inch turret as compared to its predecessor. It's also gained a couple of friends, in fact 3 of them, because you have the 2 aft mounts that you had before for the 3-inch, and there's now one right at the very back of the ship, and another 2 effectively either side of the bridge, or just forward of it, I guess. So now the ship has 6 twin 3-inch 70 caliber guns. It has, however, paid for this slightly. You know, we got more 3-inch, we got more 8-inch. Sadly, we have lost some of that massive 5-inch 54 battery, and 4 mounts in total have been deleted. We've still got the centerline fore and aft mounts, although that forward mount is only barely superfiring over turret 8-2 now. And so that means we've still got a slightly greater than split in half broadside of 5-inch 54s, with 18 out of the 32 total barrels able to bear on each broadside. Now, the other changes are also quite interesting. The 2 pyramidal superstructures have gone completely, as has one of the radar masts. So as you can see, just forward of the funnel, there is now only one tripod mast indicated, which, to be fair, probably would have been some kind of lattice later on, which is designed to mount some kind of large radar. Also, the Mark 54 fire directors have gone. So although we have 4 more 8-inch guns, there are no dedicated fire control directors for that main battery. Instead, you'll notice that it says on the far right-hand side that the Mark 37 and Mark 56 directors, of which there are still 4 apiece, are now 4 8-inch and 5-inch. The 6 3-inch mounts each have a Gunnars system, so there's now 6 of those. And as well as losing the superstructures and that were holding the Mark 54s and the radar mast that was aft, we've also got a slightly realigned fire control system. So of the remaining ones, the Mark 37s are still in a diamond pattern, but it's now a much closer to normal diamond pattern rather than the elongated one we had before, with a Mark 38 system positioned above the bridge, 2 Mark 37 systems positioned where they were before either side of the single funnel, and now we have 1 Mark 37 system positioned relatively high just aft of the funnel. The Mark 56s are still in 2 pairs, but they have also been relocated, so we have 1 pair of Mark 56s which is positioned just inside of the aftmost pair of 5-inch 54 mounts, although the side view part of the diagram does helpfully note that these Mark 56s are positioned above them, so they're not being obscured, and the other pair of Mark 56s are now directly on either side of the bridge, which means they're also at the same frame number as the forwardmost Mark 37 director. Now, this design actually has slightly more gun barrels than the previous design, because despite the significant losses to the 5-inch 54 gun battery, between the additional 3-inch and 8-inch guns, there are actually 2 more gun barrels on this ship than there were on the previous one. But the fact that they've made these sacrifices, as well as deleting 2 entire sections of superstructure and fire control directors plus a mast, tells you that even on an Iowa-class hull, they were expecting these auto-loading 8-inch gun turrets to be extremely heavy. We can already see how much additional weight you had to add to a Des Moines class to get a 9-gun armament versus pretty much the same gun but without auto-loading on the Baltimores. Now we're adding 1 gun to each of the turrets. Now, granted, they are exactly half the caliber of the 16-inch, but, well, those auto-loaders weigh an awful lot, and to be fair, there's a lot more 5-inch guns even on this design than there were on the original Iowas. And that brings us on to Scheme H. Now, in Scheme H, we're almost going full Montana on the design. We now have 4 main battery turrets, 2 sets of super-firing turrets, 1 set fore, 1 set aft, obviously still being the quad 8-inch 55 automatic firing weapons. So this ship has 16 main guns, which, if it had ever come into service, would have made it the ship with the most main battery guns of any ship ever built. Granted, it's not battleship grade weapons, but, you know, an 8-inch 55 isn't anything to be sniffed at. And, interestingly enough, the second radar mast has made a reappearance. So if we're adding a super-firing 4th turret aft, and we're putting the second radar mast back in, well, that's a lot of weight and potentially stability issues we're going to have to be dealing with. So what's been reduced? Well, the 3-inch armament is still there, pretty much exactly where it was on the previous design, but we have further reduced the 5-inch 54 battery. There are now only 14 mountings, and that's been accomplished by effectively deleting the mounting that was lower down amidships either side of the funnel. So that means the lower tier of 5-inch 54 mounts is now down to just 2. We have a 4-strong upper tier for a total of 6 broadside mounts, and then we have the pair of mounts 1 fore, 1 aft for a total of 8. So we have 16 barrels out of a possible 28 which are able to bear on either broadside, which is still an absolutely ferocious upgrade over the original Iowa class, because even on this one we have a 60% increase in 5-inch barrel count, and of course these are the longer barrel 54 caliber versions, so they're able to reach out further. And that's before we get into the 3-inch and the anti-aircraft capabilities of the 8-inch. The other detail to note here is that the aft fire control directors have basically swapped places. The Mark 54s are still long gone. We're still left with just the Mark 56s and Mark 37s to direct the entire battery, including the monstrous 8-inch gun armament. But because of the reappearance of that aft radar mast, the Mark 37 mount, which previously was finishing off quite a nice neat diamond formation, now is moving much further aft. So it's just slightly aft of the last paired set of 5-inch mountings, just forward of the centerline aft mounting, and still mounted pretty high to give it a decent arc of sight. So the 4 Mark 37 fire control directors now form something of a kite shape, as the other ones are still in their places, the foremost one sitting atop the bridge, and the 2 amidships ones sitting either side of the funnel. The 2 Mark 36 fire control directors that were previously pretty much where the aftmost Mark 37 is now have been moved, so they are now slightly forward of the main mast with radar that's been put in, because the foremast is the one that was the constant feature, and so they now sit between the main mast, which is the aftmost mast, paradoxically, and the single massively trunked funnel. Now, interestingly enough, this design retains exactly the same barrel count as the previous design, since although you're losing 2 twin 5-inch 54 mounts, you're gaining a single quad 8-inch mount, which means that the overall barrel count remains unchanged. So for those of you keeping track of the math at home, that means that schemes G and H have a total of 56 barrels, whilst scheme F has 54. So there you go. Now you know what the SCB-19 anti-aircraft battleship rearmament proposals look like, at least the last 3 of them, and roughly what barrel counts they would have had and what kind of guns. Now, for those of you who are vaguely interested in the Illinois version that's in World of Warships, we can do a quick comparison to see how it matches up against at least these historical plans. Now, obviously of the 3, it's the closest to Scheme G, the intermediate scheme, as it has the 3 quad 8-inch turrets. The most immediately obvious thing, however, is that Scheme G has lots and lots of 5-inch 54 caliber guns and some 3-inch guns and nothing less, whereas the in-game Illinois introduces an additional pair of 3-inch guns and adds a couple of dozen 20mm into the equation, whilst the secondary battery, the 5-inch battery, is reduced quite significantly. Obviously, in this particular scheme, there are 16 twin mounts for a total of 32 guns. The in-game version has 10 twin mounts of the 5-inch 38 for 20 guns. Another couple of differences, which the eagle-eyed amongst you might have spotted, is that all 3 schemes, F, G and H, all have a single massive trunked funnel. The in-game variant has 2 funnels, and of course Scheme G is actually the only one to not have a pair of radar masts, whereas the in-game one obviously does. And finally, of course, only Scheme F, the one with the 2 quad turrets, has the pyramidal superstructure with the Mark 54 fire control director, whereas this one, which as we said is similar enough to G, still retains that, even though G doesn't have either that particular brand of fire control director or that superstructure. So how does Illinois stack up against the historical schemes, at least the ones we have plans for? Well, as we said, she's the closest in layout to G, but Scheme G has a number of distinct visual differences and would actually have a far more potent anti-aircraft battery, both in terms of number of secondary gun barrels and overall capability of those barrels. But on the other hand, I suppose we don't have plans, at least they don't appear to have survived as of the moment, of what schemes A, B, C, D and E were. So maybe one of those is closer to what we see in-game, or maybe it's just an interpretation for game balance, who knows. But in any case, the main point of this video was to have a look over those 3 schemes so that everyone could have a nice long look on what a proper anti-aircraft battleship looks like. It just so happens that we have an in-game version to have a look at as well and draw some comparisons to. And with that said, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again in another video.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.